Bama baseball beat writer for the Tuscaloosa News and TideSports.com. Good morning, Ben.
Hey, Gary. How's it going?
Very well. Well, the university and Mitch Gaspard didn't waste much time. It probably wasn't, 30 minutes or so after the NCAA baseball selection show was over yesterday that Alabama sent out an email that Mitch Gaspard had resigned as the head coach of the Crimson Tide after 7 seasons. Alabama was going to wait and make that announcement at the end of the season, so they waited to see if Alabama got into a regional when the Tide did not, disappointingly so. The announcement was made. Now, Gaspard has put out a letter to the fans saying that it was 100% his decision. Bill Battle backed him on that, so it's a resignation. But do you think, had he not wanted to resign, that he would have been invited back for an 8th season?
I think, we're kind of playing the hypothetical game. I don't know how constructive that is, really. I think the important thing was to look at here is kind of that Mitch wanted to step aside to kind of make things as clean as possible. If there was a situation where he wasn't asked back or where he was fired, that can sometimes, create some animosity between players and administration or the university when they feel like their coach kind of got the axe, or, it can kind of create some lingering issues, I think, for the next coach when it comes in. But this is a case where Mitch was able to step in and decide that he wanted to step down and was able to tell the players in person about it yesterday rather than waiting until if he'd been evaluated later this week or next week and then been let go by the university. He wouldn't have gotten to say goodbye to them and wouldn't have gotten to explain things to them. So I think overall the situation worked out about as well as Alabama could have hoped it could have.
Indeed, a good, clean transition for Alabama and for Mitch Gaspard. Let's talk about this season. And I know based on what you said yesterday, or last week, you felt like it would be very iffy for Alabama to get into a regional unless they made a nice run in the NCAA tournament or the SEC tournament. They did beat Kentucky, but after that went down in 2 games. But when you look at some of the resumes of some of the teams that got in, of course, the ACC got a lot of love with 10 teams. I look at Duke, I look at Georgia Tech. As teams that I thought Alabama had a comparable resume to. For Alabama to not get in, how disappointed do you think that was for Gaspard and the players?
I'm sure they were really disappointed, and I think they really felt as though they had a valid case to get in, and also felt like, as they probably felt like all season long, that if they could get into the tournament and they could get the bats hot at the right time, that they could really do some damage. The people always talk about how pitching and pitching depth sets you up for the postseason. And while this team certainly had plenty of flaws and lots of struggles all throughout the season, it had pitching and it had pitching depth to throw guys out there for 4 games in a row and kind of keep things going. So I think that they were certainly a little bit disappointed, but looking at some of the resumes of some of the other teams, it became clear that the selection committee was leaning heavily kind of on RPI. I think the lowest ranked RPI team that got into the field was Washington at 55. The lowest RPI of an at-large team.
Right.
Was 55, that is. And Alabama, I think, was 60, 61, 62. So they understood, and Mitch obviously understood on Friday it was going to be an uphill battle for them to try and get in.
All right, before I ask you about where Alabama might turn for its next coach, let's talk about the kind of shape that the program is in. The new facility is here. It's as good as anybody's in the country, not just in terms of the ballpark, but now in terms of the support facilities with the indoor batting facility, of course, the players' lounge, the workout room, everything is top-notch. Alabama has a great tradition in baseball. Where do you think this program stands now that there's going to be a transition? How good a program is this right now? And do you think coaches around the country view it as a program that you can win at the highest level at?
I think there will certainly be some coaches out there who view it as a really attractive job and a really attractive option. Not just looking at the stadium and the facilities that are in place, but also the university itself and some of the resources that the athletic department has. Baseball, kind of like college basketball, is one of those sports where it's not unheard of for a successful coach to stick around at a mid-major for a little while where he's had some success because they might be able to match some of the coaching salaries that you might see at some schools. But Alabama is really up there in the top tier of college athletic departments when it comes to its revenue and the finances that they would have to go out and spend on some new coaches. One thing that might hurt them in this case particular is the fact that the Texas job opened up yesterday. And so if there's a home run hire out there, then you would have to think that Texas would be one of the handful of programs that could maybe outgun Alabama for a really big established college coach. But I think that there's certainly more than one coach out there who can get the job done at Alabama. and it's just a matter of finding that guy.
I was going to say, Ben, the good news is that Texas can't hire but one guy as the head coach, so that leaves a lot of possibilities. Let's talk about where Alabama might go. And again, before I get into names, I guess there's two different ways to approach a hire. You can approach it as if you're going for one of those home run hires, a big splash hire. Alabama did it, of course, with Nick Saban in football, wound up doing it with Avery Johnson. They had targeted Greg Marshall, which would have been a huge hire. Or you can say, hey, we're not going to go out and pay seven figures for a coach. We're going to look at one of these guys that's at a smaller school or maybe as a hitting coach or a pitching coach somewhere. We can groom them to be our guy and not have to pay them the huge money. Where do you think Alabama's going to go with this? Do you think they're going to try to make the huge splash, hire an established head coach for big bucks, or maybe try to find one of these up-and-comers?
Well, if you want to go ahead and follow the model of football and basketball where you hire a guy who had been successful for a while and then kind of flamed out in the pros, and you could go ahead and look at Freddie Gonzalez maybe, right?
Yeah, let's get Gonzalez in here.
Yeah. I'm not really sure. I think that there's probably possibilities on both ends of that you talk about of guys who could be successful. People, I think, sometimes get caught up in a formula of what you have to do to go out and find a coach, whether that's finding, a 34-year-old assistant who's really on the rise and going out and get that guy who could be at your program for 15 or 20 years, or it's going out and hiring a coach who's been in the ranks for 15 or 20 years at a smaller school. And I think that there are probably possibilities in both areas that could really do well at Alabama. You look at some of these guys that are out there, whether that's a guy like Mark Calvi at South Alabama or Alan Dunn, the assistant pitching coach at LSU. I don't think that there's necessarily any one reason to believe that only one type of guy could have success here.
Ben Jones, our guest, talking Bama baseball, Mitch Gaspard's departure. He's the baseball beat writer for TideSports.com and the Tuscaloosa News. All right, let's get into some names, and you mentioned a couple, but as far as home run hires, obviously the name Dan McConnell from Louisville. Of course, he's had a good program now, and he's turned that into a great program, and they've had a ton of success. I imagine Texas will mention him. Yeah. What do you hear about him?
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I think that would be a name that would be near the top of just about anyone's list looking for a college baseball coach right now. There are a couple issues there. One is obviously being Texas, and he's a name that's getting thrown around at Texas as well right now. Also, Tom Jurich at Louisville has done a really good job of holding on to a lot of his coaches over the years, even when some bigger jobs have come along. And Dan McDonnell has taken Louisville to 3 College World Series, and he's had opportunities to leave and has decided to stay at Louisville at this point. That's not to say that he's never going to leave there, but he's leaving a school where he's already gone to 3 College World Series and has a national seed this year, and you have to think about what kind of a situation he'd be looking for.
Other schools have kind of gone after Tim Corbin since he's been at Vanderbilt, and he has held serve there and has built the Commodores into a national championship program. Any possibility that his name might be involved with Alabama?
That's one name that I haven't heard to this point. Obviously, it's still pretty early for us, at least. Bill Battle has probably had 3 or 4 days to get going on this, and we're not even on 24 hours yet.
Right.
But I think another name you could probably throw in that category of, you might just give him a call and see would be John Cohen over at Mississippi State. That's another situation where you have a guy who's had success at his current school, but at the same time felt some pressure there just a couple of years ago when they missed the NCAA tournament, and maybe he likes the idea of going to Alabama where there's certainly desire for baseball success, but there's not such an intense focus on it year in and year out, and he's also from Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, the hometown boy factor there. Another couple of names that are highly respected, David Pierce at Tulane and Todd Whitting at Houston.
Yeah, those are 2 guys that Kendall Rogers of D1Baseball.com brought up yesterday, shortly after the announcement was made. David Pierce at Tulane is a guy who's just made his 5th straight NCAA tournament appearance. I think his 2nd one at Tulane, and before that he'd made 3 straight at Sam Houston State. Todd Whitting at Houston is in his 3rd straight NCAA tournament this year, and made a super regional one year. So those would be kind of along with Mark Calvi at South Alabama, a couple of the mid-major coaches that you might be looking at who could move up.
All right, a couple now of the more lower tier type coaches, but you mentioned one of them. Let's talk about Alan Dunn. Interesting candidate from Gadsden, Alabama, pitched here, was on the 1983 national runner-up team, long history of being a pitching coach in professional baseball, and now obviously, even though they didn't have a great year this year by their standards, has done a terrific job handling the pitchers at LSU. Has not been a head coach, but has the fact that he played here and is at a very successful program. How serious of a candidate do you think he might wind up being?
I think he'd certainly be one of those guys that you'd take a look at. He wouldn't be a home run hire on the order of like a Dan McDonald or someone like that, or a John Cohen. But I think he's probably a more realistic candidate than either of those two guys. Along with, if you're looking at kind of the Cajun division of possible candidates, you can also probably throw Andy Cannizaro,
right,
the hitting coach and the recruiting coordinator at LSU there in the mix. I think that either of those guys are probably due for head coaching jobs at some point soon based on the success that they've had there and what they've done at LSU. One thing I think that's probably going to come up in this interview whenever it happens and whomever it happens with is some of the conversations around the scholarship limitations and how a coach will have a plan to work around that. And, I would bet that it comes up on each side of the conversation. I would bet that Bill Battle talks to the candidates about how they're going to handle that, and I bet each of the candidates would want to talk to Bill Battle about if the university is going to be able to help them handle that. And so if you're looking at guys who at least have some kind of a concept of what it's like recruiting in the state of Alabama without the lottery money to help you on scholarships, then guys who have ties to the program like Alan Dunn or guys who have done it before in the state like Mark Calvey make a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, we'll do I'll tell you what, we're going to do a show here soon, Ben, and I'm going to get you in, maybe get a couple other panelists, and we're just going to talk about this ridiculous deal with baseball only given 11.7, and then some schools having the lottery to build their scholarships around, and then also some schools like Ole Miss and Mississippi State not having out-of-state tuition for athletes the way Alabama and Auburn do. Alabama and Auburn are really hamstrung, and I hate when I bring that up and people say, well, that's an excuse. It's not an excuse. It's a reality. And people say, well, how does it work? Well, this is how it works. You got the University of Georgia. They're taking some of their top kids from in-state, and they're giving them Hope scholarships, and they come into Birmingham, and there's a pitcher at Vestavia, Alabama, offers him 50% because they've only got the 11.7, and Georgia comes in and offers him 80%. That's how it works in a nutshell, and that's how it's killing Alabama and Auburn. But that's another story for another day, but I just can't believe the NCAA continues to not do anything about this and address it. Can you imagine in football if some of the schools in the SEC had 95 scholarships and some had 85?
It's like in football when Bear Bryant years and years ago started stashing athletes away on the track and field team, and they had to change the rules to make sure that if a football player was on campus and on the football team, he was there on a football scholarship, right?
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. And, baseball gets no respect. And I understand Title IX and understand the scholarships have to be done the way that they are. But if you could just go to 15 scholarships for baseball, that would solve the problem across the board. You can't tell me you couldn't fund another 3.3 scholarships for baseball. But anyway, another story for another time. I'll get on a rant here if I don't watch it. All right, a couple more names I'm going to throw you out here that are in-state sitting head coaches. Let's start with Sanford's Casey Dunn. And I know he's an Auburn guy, but way back in the day, Ben, long before you were here, you might not know this, but his father, Sammy, was offered the head job at Alabama before Jim Wells took it. He was the head coach at Vestavia Hills High School. They're an Auburn family. Casey played at Auburn, but has been passed over a couple of times down there, and there are many baseball head coaching changes that they've had over the last 15 or 20 years, and from what I understand, the relationship now between him and Auburn is not the best. He's done a good job at Sanford. They beat Alabama this year over in Birmingham. Is he somebody that might get some consideration?
Yeah, I would say he's a guy that you might want to look into. I haven't heard as much about him as I've heard of some of the other guys. Mark Calvey, at least in this kind of first 24 hours, is the name that I've probably heard thrown around the most. Like we've talked about, if you're looking for guys who have ties to the state and are able to recruit within the state and understand the limitations of some of the scholarships and good ways to work around that, then a guy who's had some success at Sanford would be another one to look at.
And another name is Mervil Melendez at Alabama State, who, let's be honest, it's Alabama State in the SWAC, but he has done a really nice job there.
24-0 in conference this year, right?
Yeah, you can't do any better than that.
Yeah. So, and on 24-0 in conference, if you're beating your competition that badly, I think you're probably going to get some better opportunities. I don't know if his next opportunity is going to be at at Alabama or someplace else, but you'd have to think that he's a guy who's going to get looked at by some other programs here.
Timetable-wise, Ben, do you have any thoughts or any idea when Alabama might make a hire?
No, I think some of that's so fluid. Say, and just hypothetically here, this is not what I'm hearing, but say you're after one of those two assistants at LSU, like we've talked about, and they end up in the College World Series, which goes, almost until the end of June if you end up being one of the teams in the championship. This is something that, you might not have totally done until then. You might be able to announce it but not introduce the coach. Or if it's a different guy, then maybe it's something that, they could announce by the end of this week. I think it really depends on what direction they start to take the hire. And it's still kind of a little bit early to tell on that.
And finally, and we alluded to this earlier with Mitch Gaspard resigning on his own and the statement that he put out, the letter to the fans. You talked to him yesterday. I don't sense any bitterness at all. I sense genuine gratitude. Of course, not just as a head coach, but his time as an assistant under Jim Wells. He spent, I think you might have said in your story, 16 years total in Tuscaloosa. His girls have grown up here. You don't get the sense that there's any disappointment. Sure, that they didn't do more and didn't get to more regionals and get to a College World Series, but he doesn't seem to have any animosity at all toward Alabama.
No, not at all. And when I spoke with him yesterday, you can read the full transcript of that on tidesports.com if you're a member. If you're not, you can sign up for a 30-day free trial with code TIDE30, capital T and no space there in it. But he was very realistic when we talked to him. Some folks have talked about whether it was realistic for Alabama to expect a College World Series appearances given some of those scholarship limitations, and he said that he'd expected to get to the College World Series at least once in his first 7 years and hopefully a couple times. I think one of the phrases he used was marginal success, saying that they really thought they could have major success here at Alabama, but instead they'd had marginal success. I think he was really very pragmatic and understanding kind of what had happened and the opportunity that was here and how the results played out, and really handled it well, given how it ended.
What about the staff? Andy Phillips, Dax Norris, David Kendrick. Any thought process that they might try to stay on with the new coach, or you think this is basically a deal where everybody's out?
The default in a situation like this, you'd expect everybody to be out. That obviously might change based on whoever comes in, if he has some kind of ties to the program or has worked with one of those guys before or played with him and has some kind of a comfort level. It's also possible, like you might have heard during the season, that Dax might stick around but might not be the pitching coach, might move back over to hitting coach or something like that. That's just kind of all speculation, kind of up in the air based on whoever it is next. I think that there's possibilities that those guys might end up going with Mitch if Mitch were to take another head coaching job, or you might see a guy like Nathan Kilcrease catch on as a pitching coach at Mitch's next stop.
All right. Well, that's the latest on the Alabama baseball coaching situation from Ben Jones, Tuscaloosa News and Tidesports.com. Again, he mentioned he's got a great interview at Tidesports.com with Mitch Gaspard. After talking with him yesterday, you can go read that there. If you're not a member, you can sign up for a free trial. Appreciate the time, Ben.
Hey, Gary. Thanks for having me.